We are now live, and
I'm
looks
certainly
like we
live.
got sound. Looks like we're good. Hey, everybody, welcome to my bonus live stream. I'm still calling these bonus live streams because I'm not sure I want to do these every Tuesday, but so far I've managed to find a reason to do them and sometimes bring people on board too. And this has been a lot of fun. So welcome to my Tuesday bonus live stream. And as you can see, I am joined by my brilliant friend, John Atack. Hey, John, welcome to my live stream.
Hey, and you notice that I've gone against my dress code, joined you, and I am wearing a t-shirt because it's too hot here.
I'll say here too, man. How is it? How's it been over there? Europe is, or England's known for all of its rain and fog and all that. How's it? How's it going now with the heat?
We've actually since March we had the hottest March, the hottest April, the hottest May on record. June has had some rain, thankfully, so the garden is still alive. But I have never in my life seen anything like it. I'm very glad that the stable genius, who is the leader of the world, tells me that global warming is not happening, because
Yeah,
it sure as heck is happening here.
yeah, right. You have to wonder when you see the repeating year after year after year temperatures just kind of slowly doing this. Excuse me, and polar ice caps melting. I mean, just those two pieces of information alone tell me empirically something's up. Whether that's verifiable absolute proof of man-made climate change, I think people would have issues with, but I definitely think something is up. And of course I
It's
follow with science, so
a straw man. The idea that it's human made is absolutely a straw man. The fact that it's happening means that humans should be doing something to
there
limit
we
it, whether we are the main cause or not.
that's right.
Preventative principle. And the most worrying thing is for me is what's happening in Greenland, where most of our icebergs come from. Where you've got the great glaciers and they are melting, 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 and now Antarctica, which held for quite a while, seems to be melting. The funny thing is, though, that it could mean that in the next 10 years, Trump Towers will be underwater.
Yes, which I find humorously ironic.
Yes, there is. At least the basement's going to be rather damp, and the woman who headed the design team on it said that while the building itself is fantastic, and I tend to agree, it's a pretty building, they use the cheapest possible materials on the inside. And she was in charge of the project. That's in Trump: An American Dream, where she's interviewed.
All right, on Netflix. Yeah,
Fine
that
documentary.
yeah, exactly. Hey Joyce, thanks for that super chat. Awesome. Yeah. Well, I am excited to have you on live. I don't know that we've ever done a live stream before.
I've only actually ever done one live stream, and that was from Dublin in 2015. So
Okay, cool. Well, this will be interesting. Live is always a little bit more fun just because it's like there's no takebacks.
yeah.
But normally speaking, when you and I do our long conversations, other than taking bathroom breaks, I rarely have to hit the edit button for anything
Mm.
when we
And of
do our.
course, we won't be allowed to take any bathroom
No,
breaks.
not this time. No. That's funny. Okay, well, I had a few things. There's a lot going on right now in the world, of course, as there tends to always be. But a lot of angst, a lot of controversy, a lot of people like really riled up about stuff, and it makes sense that they would be because, there's we got COVID. We've got an election year in the United States, which has universal worldwide consequences, and so everybody's paying attention.
Yeah.
We do have I won't go so far as to say madman, but certainly a difficult, unprincipled, civically illiterate person running our United States right now. Running the executive branch. And a very, very divided and divisive and argumentative Congress, which seems to be more interested in playing for political points than it does for moving the ball down the road for the country. So people are really riled up. And then in the middle of this, of course, the Black Lives Matter things happens. And that's not what we're going to talk about today, but just in terms of the stuff going on. And then we have climate change on top of that. And, just a lot of uncertainty out there, a lot of crazy
and the
stuff.
shortage for 2 months of toilet paper in the Western world,
Yeah. Let's not forget that.
I learned a new word the other week, and the word is cacocracy. Have you heard that word?
Oh, tell me. I think I've heard that word, but tell me, what does that mean?
You can spell it either K-A-K or C-A-K. It's been in the English language apparently since, I think, 1841 or something. And it means the government by the worst people, the cacocrats.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
And looking around the world at the moment, Abe, Modi, Boris Johnson, Scott Morrison, Duterte, Bolsonaro, that wherever you go, it appears that our system has put the cacocrats in charge. Now, the US is actually a plutocracy. It's never been anything else. It's always been ruled by the rich. The privilege just moved over. I like the story about George Washington that says that one of his first acts as president was to say that nobody could sit down if he was in the room until he'd sat down. And you go, so he actually became, the next
Wow.
King George immediately. And he had slaves' teeth. People in your history book says wooden teeth. They weren't. They were slaves' teeth, and he kept slaves. So I think we need to change the names of everything named after Washington and Jefferson, because let's face it, they both kept slaves. So we could rename Washington, D.C. Obviously, it can't be Columbia anymore because Columbus was a bad person. We could call it Trump District of Trumpania. Washington State has to go. All of the high schools, everything. It's all got to change. Yep.
Yeah, sure.
And we can have like Oscar Peterson, Nat King Cole, some people who really have contributed something, Langston Hughes, something positive. We'd have Muhammad Aliville and things like that. It'd be much better.
Okay. I'm just going to move right on now.
No answer to that, John.
Nope, not going there. Builder Guy, thank you very much for that super chat, by the way. Appreciate it, man. Okay. Yeah, I definitely have some issues with the historical revisionism going on right now. I am definitely about let's take away Columbus Day and all that. I mean, some of this stuff is definitely ludicrous. But then the pendulum swing all the way the other direction is also a little bit silly too. I mean, just because if we're going to get rid of everybody who's ever owned slaves in all of history and consider that none of their ideas were any good because of the culture and situation that they were in, I think we're going to end up painting ourselves into a corner that's going to be very, very hard to get out of.
Yeah, I mean, I did a little piece with my friend Eddie on my YouTube channel where we talked about statues, and we talked with Yuval Laor about this before, and we came to this thing, which is you take the statues, you put them in a park, and then you put a sign on them, probably hung around their neck, saying what they actually did. Yeah. And then once a year, maybe on their birthday, but just one day a year anyway, you go and throw rotten fruit at them. And that way, I mean, their only historical value, people talk about history, but their only historical value is in fashion, that you can see what people wore when the statues were. I've got no idea who half these people were. We have agreed here to take Cecil Rhodes, or Cecil Rhodes, as he's called in the US, to take his statue down from Oriel College, because he was a dreadful human being. But put him in a museum, do something else with them. The reality is that we need to be better people. And
well, I agree with that. I also agree that we'll say that judging people on one thing only is a little bit rough when you're talking about people who have made major contributions to the historical line of where we are now,
I think,
and I'm talking about Washington and Jefferson here, like the founding fathers specifically are the ones that I sort of start going about. But
well, I mean, Jefferson advocated the genocide of the Native Americans.
Okay,
Yep.
that's awful.
That's not
Jefferson
very
also
good,
read
is
the
it?
Declaration of Independence. I mean, I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
that's true. That was awful.
Hmm.
I was in Scientology for 25 years. That was awful.
I
I
don't think
did
I
an
want to
awful
talk to you
thing.
anymore now that you told me that.
But yeah, I mean, but there's a good and a bad to all of us, and I don't think it serves any of us uh, to just focus on one or the other. Now, obviously, somebody like Hitler, you kind of go, okay, whoa, 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 I'm not
He
looking
was a
for Hitler.
vegetarian. He brought in
Yeah.
the Audubon system. He brought in the first animal rights law in history. And he recognized 20 years before Richard Dole that smoking causes lung cancer. So, yeah, even somebody that bad, not that I'm saying that being a vegetarian is a good thing, don't get me wrong, but it, there are all sorts of things going on. I think there are people who are just bad and bad. You know,
Yeah,
like Stalin, who to get his
yeah,
own back on his home population, the Ossetians,
right.
moved them all 500 miles away. There are people who are making up for the childhood slights, the Ron Hubbards of this world, who are going to get everybody back. I mean, Hubbard, of course, in '68 told Charlie Nairn, who asked him, why do you do it? He said, I like to catch the clever ones and reel them in. And you're going, oh, he's a 10-year-old. And somebody said, hey, fat kid, you've got acne,
Mm-hmm,
and he's
mm-hmm.
going to he's going to have his revenge on the whole world. So I think there are people who've crossed the line of bad, and like Ted Bundy, for example. I can't think of any redeeming features for Ted Bundy at the moment.
Exactly. See, that's where you're talking about somebody who's just their whole entire claim to fame is evil.
But they're tiny.
And
It's a tiny number.
I don't want any monuments to that guy. I don't want any statues. I don't want to remember that guy. I don't want to
Well,
remember Jeffrey Dahmer. He's just an horrible person, you know.
well,
Some people are
Dahmer I'd take exception with, because at the end of his life, Dahmer actually started showing remorse and talking about what he'd done, and then he was murdered because of the prison system being what it is. But he could have given us an insight. Ted Bundy was absolutely without conscience, as far as
yeah.
I know. But
Now I've read all the interviews with him and the transcripts and stuff, and yeah, he was awful.
yeah, not a very nice man at all. Though
No,
very good
not
at
at all.
embroidery, so.
Yeah. Well, in the awful Olympics, as Joyce is mentioning here, there's a lot of bad, there's a lot of good, and that's the human condition. And speaking of, I'm now going to sort of forcefully segue here into the beginnings of what we're going to be talking about here today. And that, first off, I wanted to start off with censorship and free speech. Because this is rearing its kind of ugly head again. Yesterday, some people were deplatformed off of YouTube, and I get it. I get the arguments on this. Really do. I've been on both sides of it, actually. As far as yeah, it's a private corporation. They can do what they want. It's not a free speech issue because it's not First Amendment, and that's the Bill of Rights, and that's governments. And I go, yeah, okay, but there's also the free speech aspect of human rights. It's one of the first of the human rights elucidated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is
the European Convention of Human Rights includes it. Freedom of association and freedom of speech are human rights. They are not to be imposed by government merely.
Exactly. So I believe that corporations should be paying some degree of attention to that, especially when, thanks, Kathy, for that, especially when they are almost at the level of having become, I think this is a valid argument, that social media platforms have become such an ubiquitous and important part of our lives that it's not a matter of opting in or opting out. If you want to promote your business, if I want to promote my videos, if I want to get the word out to people broadly, I have to use these platforms. And that's just the world we live in now. So it's not just a matter of opting in or opting out,
Well, unless we return to like Pigeon Post, and you start sending messages that way.
Right.
But it could be very expensive in the number of pigeons you'd have to buy. So
exactly. So I'm not down with deplatforming people because of the ideas they're espousing. I am, and I've said before, and I actually don't feel inconsistent in this, in saying that, I railed against Alex Jones specifically because his speech was inciting people to go commit criminal acts. They were stalking and harassing the victims of I think it was the Parkland shooting or one of the shooting incidents, and these poor parents couldn't even go to their child's graves because they'd be stalked and harassed by Alex Jones fans, calling them all fakes and hoaxes and things like that while they're grieving, mourning the loss of their kids.
Dreadful.
I think that's where you're crossing lines. But to merely talk about ideas, and those ideas are unpopular, okay, we're gonna take away your right to talk about those ideas on this platform, which is the platform of speech. That's where I start having issues, because once you open that door, it's real hard to close it.
I do think there's a differentiation. I worked with Steve Hassan on a chapter, here we are plugging, in an Oxford University Press book that's meant to be coming out next year about radicalization. And it meant that I had to go and visit white nationalist sites in the US to find out about Dylan Roof.
Oh, yeah.
And I had to read his Last Rhodesian, that's his manifesto, which is an ignorant piece of guff. And of course, he has the Bowl Gang. He has all these people who are seeking to emulate him. But it meant that I went to Spencer's site and I saw these things. And as somebody who lives in the UK, I was instantly shocked at the language I was seeing. Words that under our law are listed as hate speech.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got there is another law, which is the incitement to riot, the incitement to hatred, the incitement to bring people to do nasty things. So I think that there is, that social media platforms have a justification if they are seeing particular words, which we won't repeat here, which are accepted within the culture as derogatory terms towards groups within the society. So I think there should be some response to that. But stopping somebody from talking about an idea, no matter how strongly they hold it, I've talked with Holocaust deniers, and it's a subject I have a personal difficulty with, because my father was with the troops that liberated Belsen. So when somebody tells me it didn't happen, there's a witness within my own family who saw what had happened. The film A Painful Reminder, which is on YouTube, bits of it, shows, and the guy who made the film, immediately they got to Belsen, they started filming. And he said that he did panning shots to show that they weren't making anything up. And you see the local German citizens who were forced by the British to bury the bodies. And when somebody tells me, well, the Jews starved because the Allies cut the food lines and that's what happened, you go, well, the citizens of the local town were healthy enough to bury the emaciated bodies. So there was a certain amount of rationing that went on where these people were considered to be, I think the word is Untermensch, underlings. So, but nonetheless, in getting into a conversation with Holocaust deniers, as long as they don't sort of bang off into some mad anti-Semitic theory, which they often do, I'm very happy to talk about the facts. I'm very happy to talk about the evidence, even though for me this is a passionate subject. This is something that grieves me. That we also had, Steve and I had a chapter, the plugs are going wild here. We had a chapter in a book called Psychiatry and Anti-Semitism, which came out in April, which led me to have to go, well, what is anti-Semitism? What does it mean? Who are the Semites? They're not a race of people. They're not a coherent religion of people. There are all sorts of dissenting voices in that community. There are Black Jews, there are Arab, Yemeni Jews, there are Jews from Eastern Europe. What is it that puts this group together that makes them an object of hate? Especially when you consider that much of that now is in the US. And my thought is that the Caucasian population, the European population of the US, as well as all being immigrants, let's face it, they come from nations that have been fighting each other tooth and nail for millennia. And now
Mhm.
suddenly they're all a group together fighting somebody else. And it shows you this, the shift is an abstract one. It's a cultural one that people come to believe, well, we're white. And the
Right.
biological reality is that white's just a paler form of black, that we're all actually black. It's just how dark we are, because we all came
Exactly.
from the same place. Ridiculous.
Exactly. Well, it's actually not dissimilar. The United States is actually, just because this was on my mind the last couple of days, as people were pointed out, or I was talking about it, the United States, we people come to these ex cult communities or get into them, um, and are often soon surprised, disappointed, shocked, whatever, at the fracturedness of the communities, about how there's allies and enemies and factions and groups, and within this community of people who were formerly all part of this cultic group, whether it's and this seems to be universal. Ex-Muslims, ex-JWs, ex-Mormons, ex-Scientologists, all of them have commented on it. And with varying degrees of upset and turmoil, and how could this be? And I thought we were all supposed to be on the same page. This also happens in the atheist world. Atheists are all over the map as far as politics, ideology, culture, etc.
Yeah.
So we don't all get together on the same page on much of anything. And then there's all this, well, I thought we were one, kumbaya, and this kind of thing. And I was definitely there for years coming into the ex-Scientology world. I thought we were all on the same page. I thought we were all fighting Scientology. This is what we're going to do, blah, blah, blah. And then you quickly find out, no, that's not how it is at all. And
it's a change that happened, and it's a change that I observed. I left in '83 when the factioneering was already beginning, but it was only in the beginnings. And I remember in November '83 having a conversation with a representative of David Mayo's Advanced Ability Center in Santa Barbara, who told me that once they had successfully defended themselves from the mother cult, as I like to think of it, that then they would sort out the squirrels. And the particular squirrel that this person was talking about was the leader of a group called the Phoenix Association in Los Angeles. But they were also, I was assured, going to get Bent Corridon. And they, and it was like, I'm sort of, you what?
You're right. Wait, what?
Yeah. So in the UK,
you see this actually. There's a guy running around in the out there right now who is adamant about getting ethics in on the indie community, on the X community. And you just look at this and go, dude, what reality are you living in that you think all of us feel like we need to listen to what you have to say? Like what?
And people come away with different kinds of damage and different kinds of obsession. And I mean, we both know that the, if you look at Kubler-Ross's stages of grieving, and I'm not a fan of her work generally, but denial, it didn't do anything to me. I didn't accept any of those ideas. I mean, I remember a friend of mine telling me that she never really believed in Scientology. And I said, okay, hang on. You gave up £1 million business and gave them all the money. You left your home in England, in London, and moved to Los Angeles to work a 90-hour week and she was better paid than most because she was working directly for Laurel Sullivan, who worked directly for Hubbard. So I think she got $20 a week, You gave the care of your, I think, 8-year-old child to people with no experience in childcare. So tell me, what would you have done if you had believed?
Good question.
And
exactly
that way of making ourselves right, so that it all made sense, and we were being sensible. And you just got to accept, I was fooled, I was deceived.
Right.
From the start. L. Ron Hubbard had not cured any of his conditions. He died with asthma and short-sightedness, despite his claims. He had not cleared 272 people, as he said in Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health. He was a fraud.
Right.
And it doesn't work. As much as we would like it to work, It doesn't work. There are no clears by his definition, and there sure as heck are no operating thetans with supernatural powers, because they wouldn't need to have burgled all those government officers if by remote viewing they could have seen the documents. So
Yeah, exactly.
it was just something else. But people come away, denial is the first thing, it didn't affect me in any way. The second is anger. And a lot of people get stuck in that. And rather than trying to be, I've told the story before. A friend of mine was in the rehabilitation project force in Florida at the Flag Land Base. This 20 years ago or more than 20 years ago. And no, so he is the lowest of the low. He is dressed in black, can't talk to anybody, doesn't get enough sleep, has to run from one job to another, cleans the toilets, eats food scraps from a place where they're only eating rice and beans anyway. So he has been shoved down to this. And there was a protest. And one of the protesters spat at him. And it's like, okay, let's check some L. Ron Hubbard here. The suppressive person always chooses the wrong target. And the target is not Scientologists. I mean, right. Ken Urquhart, Hubbard's deputy, accused me, and Ken's a nice guy, but he accused me of being an anti-Scientologist. And it's sort of, if there's one thing that I'm not, and that L. Ron Hubbard was, it's an anti-Scientologist. I gave away years of my life, not to make money or to become celebrated, and though people, if they want to celebrate me and send me money, they can, but because I was so concerned that so many people came to me and said, I need help. And Scientology, having drained their bank accounts, forced them into loans that they'd be repaying for years, fractured their families, and done all of these things that are quite natural in Scientology, hadn't helped them. And often it just takes an afternoon to get them to think another way. But if they come out and they had a rage to start with, and they feel righteous about things, and they're tolerant of other people's ideas, then you get these battles. It wasn't like this. Back in 83, 84, there was tremendous, I left the teachings of Scientology by the beginning of 1984. I wanted nothing more to do with it. And independents came to me and begged me to keep running Reconnection magazine because they felt they couldn't, and to help them in their legal cases. And I spent years, Mayo, I got $2.9 million for his lawyers and $1,000 for me. Not very clever, really. Ben Corridon, I helped him get his building back in Riverside, $2 million building. He didn't pay me. But I did what I could to help people who were suffering. My emphasis was not upon Scientology being wrong and me being right, or my version or brand. I'm not here to sell a philosophy. I'm not here to sell very much at all. Only that we do need to get rid of all of this nonsense and try to be compassionate, because if we aren't compassionate, we either hang together or we hang separately, as Benjamin Franklin put it.
Exactly.
And we just see this commotion in that world.
Yeah, exactly. I think that this business of, getting stuck in these stages, if they are that way, and I know that it's, these things have been misquoted and misused so often that it's a little fuzzy as to where this even applies. But I think that you certainly see empirically people stuck in anger, people stuck in grief, people stuck in denial, and you want to get them to move past that stuff. I mean, I've certainly had those stages of experiences I guess over the years here, and have now gotten to a place where I literally, really just hardly care about it anymore. I mean, as far as a topic, for me goes, I've moved way beyond let's get rid of the Scientology teachings, and now I'm embracing a whole new data set, which is the world.
So. Let's get people to look at the Scientology teachings rationally. Let's see empirically if it works.
Well, exactly, and we know it doesn't.
Yeah,
we know some parts of it do sometimes.
In and some we go, ways.
Okay, there's a reason for that. Dianetics, for example, can help you sort out, the causative elements in your past that you might not be looking at, and sort out some responsibility issues maybe. But that's few and far between. Do we get an honest result like that? Most of the time, it's just poppycock.
There's a front door, back door involvement there as well. That what comes in through the front door where you're watching and what comes in through the back door are two different things.
Yeah.
Dianetics is not a safe technique
Right.
because it tends to bring false memories. Can you remember being born? Can you remember your past lives? And the problem that I've found with many people, and I've now had decades to watch this, nearly 4 decades of watching ex-members. And because I interviewed some people in the mid 1980s or the early 1980s, those people, and I'm not going to mention any names, I see the statements, historical statements they're making now, and they don't match up. They've changed their minds about what happened to them and where the responsibility lay. The reality is, the Challenger study where people, their professor asked them to write down, the thing that knocked L. Ron Hubbard off the front pages, the terrible Challenger. And when they came back, I think it was 2 years later, only 10% of them were accurate in recounting their memories. And one of the guys looked at his thing and he said, well, that's my handwriting, but that's not what happened.
Right.
So
exactly.
that confidence that always makes me the hero of my own life, as Dickens said, is something we have to profoundly question,
That's right. These are actually really important issues, and the memory thing especially, which is why I'm really looking forward to getting Jonas back on to. We're going to do the next neuroscience episode is going to be all about memory.
Good.
Because that has so much to do with how we act and how we believe things, and if people only knew how bad their memories really were, it's really quite something.
Yeah, there's a very good book. There's a very good book by Schachter, who's head of psychology at Harvard, The 7 Sins of Memory. Very good, which shows, like threshold effect, that people say, oh, I must be getting old because I just went to get something and I can't remember what it was. And you go, no, it's called the threshold effect, and we all have it. That as soon as you've crossed the threshold out of the room, you go, what was I going to get?
That's right. That's right.
It's not to mention
exactly. You literally, your body walks into the kitchen, right? Like I'm talking about it like a Scientologist as though it's something different
body.
from me, right? My body. Like I walk into the kitchen, and by the time I get there, I'm like, okay, I know I came in here for something, but you have no memory of what you're even doing there sometimes, Anyway.
Yeah,
fascinating topic, but let's get over to governments and stuff because I want to get back onto that. And the only thing I wanted to say about the free speech thing was, there's a lot of arguments there. This is not a show on free speech. I'm only pointing this up as an indicator, a flag of something, which is where we're going to go, which is governments and cults and stuff. And the free speech thing for me is like, if I'm forced to choose between free speech absolutism, anything goes, anytime, anywhere, any word, no matter what, versus, this monolithic, nameless, faceless people who are making decisions outside of my purview based on rules I never agreed to about what I get to say to people on a broad basis when I'm trying to educate and I'm trying to inform and I'm trying to help. And other people get to decide based on completely arbitrary and mostly wrong ideas about me and what I'm trying to do. I'm going to go with the free speech absolutism. Now I know those are not the choices that are particularly presented. I get that, and I'm not a free speech absolutist. I've got all kinds of ideas about where regulations should and shouldn't exist, or where common decency should take over. But I have to go that direction versus, having had the lived experience, and you have had this as well, of, and especially in the Sea Org for me, of literally, not sort of academically, not in some ivory tower way, but literally having the experience of being told repeatedly, sit down, shut up, you don't get to talk, your ideas don't matter, we don't care what you think. This just goes on and on for years in these groups, in groups like Scientology. And when you live something like that and you come out in the big wide world and you see this Bill of Rights that says you have freedom of speech, the government won't impinge on that. And then you read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and you go, yeah, free speech, European human rights, free speech. And you go, this is important. And then people are like, well, I don't like what he has to say, so he shouldn't be there. And you're just like, I think you kind of missed the point somewhere along the line, and that, and you end up with egg on your face almost 100% of the time in the social media battles, because you end up having to defend the likes of David Duke and Richard Spencer, who I hate, who I want to have nothing to do with, who I literally think are human garbage. Yet I have to, on principle.
When you say you literally think they are human garbage, are you suggesting
human garbage? I hate these guys.
Throw them on the trash heap.
I mean, I doubt, they're human beings. They have thoughts, feelings, emotions, attitudes, ideas, and I get it, but I just can't. I'm trying to make an extreme point here that I don't agree with anything those guys are talking about.
Well, I mean, Noam Chomsky got into trouble because he went to France to defend the professor who was put in prison for denying the Holocaust. And people were saying, "Oh, so you agree with him?" And he was saying, "No, it's what is it? I hate what you say, but I will defend to your death the right to say it."
Exactly.
But there are some very interesting points here in pulling this argument apart. Have you seen The Brainwashing of My Dad?
I think so. Is that about the conservative woman who? I think I had her on my podcast. Her father grew up under like the whole 50s conservative John Birch Society.
No. The Brainwashing of My Dad. Basically, her father had been a lovely, friendly, compassionate man, and he started listening to right-wing radio and watching Fox News, and she got curious, so she put out this thing asking other people to comment, and she got lots of Skype interviews with people, her own age group, middle-aged people whose elderly parents had become angry. That was the main thing about it. They'd become angry. There was one guy who decided he wouldn't talk to his daughter again because she'd said something nice about Barack Obama. Now,
right.
I think, so there is this other issue that if you have a media that is absolutely spewing forth false information and hatred, that there has to be some reaction to that. And I think the reaction to that should be in education. It should be in teaching people how to spot fake news.
Yes,
propaganda.
That's right. So, well, that's where we get into the critical thinking education.
Yeah,
right. Because a democracy will only exist for any length of time with an informed populace who can think.
Yeah.
Who can reason, understand, and that's never happened exactly. But we understand that that's how it's supposed to look, and we can try to push in that direction. Actually, getting now, let's segue a little bit. I'm going to push this in another direction a little bit, which building on what you just said, though, governments versus cults. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and get into this, because governments. I had arguments with people all the time about how the United States government's a big cult. The British government's a big cult. Western governments are big cults, right? And they're all cults. And this is kind of the same kind of argument. I think it's not. I'm not going to say it's lazy thinking, because I don't think the people who are making these arguments are being lazy. But I think it's not a well-informed argument, because I think that there is a huge difference between a government body and a destructive cult, as we define it, as laid out with Yanya's checklist or all the things we've talked about. I've had this reductionist thing of it's an abusive relationship, which is true enough, but it's way too reductionist, because there are abusive relationships that exist that are not cults. So I think this is where people get a little confused, is because they see the trappings or the tool set of cults being utilized in a non-cult arena and think, oh, well, that's a cult, because they're using propaganda, they're using coercive persuasion, they're using manipulation, they're using physical discipline, they are overriding people's ability to speak freely, talk freely, like in boot camp or something. Like the military is a big cult. And you go, well, okay, what I wanted to consult with you on this and talk about in the show here was, I think that if I was going to put a sort of a hypothesis forward on this, I would say that there's a tool set that gets utilized. And this really got clear to me after I started checking out Machiavelli and Bernays, right? And you come to realize that these guys are actually just documenting some aspects of what the tool set is. Divide and conquer, right? Ultimately at the bottom of the whole thing is might is right, but you have this, you have to have force behind you in order to be able to exert your will on a mass of people. But you can also, if you come above, if you evolve past might is right, and my army is going to kill your army, and that's how we'll determine who's right here. You then get into the tools of mass manipulation. You're going to talk to populations. You're going to have to convince them of things, and that involves appeal to emotion, appeal to authority, all kinds of other things that could be, considered logical fallacies. But so it might not be the best reasoning, but it is how you get people to do things. You don't get people to do things by sitting them all down in a big group and carefully explaining to them all the this and that and the other things that you as the leader have to deal with, and then go, okay, everybody, so what do you think? I think I should do this, right? That's never how it works. Instead, how it works is you want to get X done, and you go, okay, X is good, and you start telling everybody about how good X is and how bad anti-X is, and people go, oh, wow, okay, well, let's do X, and you're revving them up with appeals to emotion and all that, and that's where Bernays comes in with propaganda. And anyway, there's a lot of tools in this tool set. I don't want to, propaganda is a big topic. Government's a big topic, but I think that there is a tool set that I will call the tool set of mass manipulation or mass governance. And really the question becomes, for what purpose are you utilizing this tool set, and to what end? Are you doing it because, as an L. Ron Hubbard or a Jim Jones, you're just trying to accumulate people, to accumulate wealth and power and this sick kind of admiration that you want as an individual? With the JWs, that started back in the day. Now it's a council of people, but it's still the same concept of let's utilize this tool set to control and manipulate this group of people. Cult leaders do it for their own personal advantage. Governments do it because they're trying to govern a group of people who have wildly different ideas and a wildly different set of information about what's actually going on. And the media, and this made me think of this when you were just talking about the media just now, the media comes into play, and they have platforms that can communicate to lots and lots of people. And depending on how well or how badly they are informing this population, has a lot to do with the thinking of the population and how they're going to respond to the governance. You could have the best government in the world and the worst media in the world and end up with a very confused mess.
Absolutely. If you look, for example, at history, and anybody who's familiar with Monty Python knows that nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, but the Spanish Inquisition is largely an invention of the Dutch Protestant propaganda machine. And things that people still believe about the Spanish Inquisition, which nobody expects, do absolutely come from propaganda. That, in fact, the Protestants burned more witches than the Spanish Inquisition burned heretics. So we should also, there's so much to say in response to that. I've got a little pad and I've already written 7.
Yeah, no, I know, I do. Let me bring it down.
Let me make it more complicated for you, John, by adding another 9 points before you get.
No. Let me try to summarize where I'm going with that, and then I'm very keen to hear what you have to say. And Terry, thank you very much for that super chat just now. That was very generous. Thank you. What I'm trying to say is that there is a tool set that exists beyond cult leaders, right? They either organically figure this out or they read about it. The leadership over time through history has either figured this stuff out on their own or they've somehow been tutored on it or whatever. If you're going to lead groups and groups of people, this tool set comes into play. Emotional manipulation, coercive persuasion, all propaganda, all these things that we talk about. But we can paint all these tools with a black brush and go, oh, all propaganda is bad, right? All control is bad. But we know that's not true. We know you have to manipulate people sometimes for their own good. We know you have to, and manipulate's a rough word there, so maybe I should use other words there, but you have to give people, okay, masks are good, right? Masks are good. Like, that's a piece of propaganda. It
I
has
didn't
to
see
be
any at that many at the Tulsa rally, I must say. But
yeah, no, I mean, it's based on good science. See, that's the thing about propaganda and about manipulation, is it can be based on lies or it can be based on truth. So it's, in and of itself, it's just a tool set for how to communicate to people and get them to respond. And you get them to respond through emotion. So I think it comes down to the cult leader's toolbox or toolkit is actually the same toolbox or toolkit that all leaders of mass movements or governments or societies or cultures utilize, but they kind of go to the dark side with it. They take it to the darkest points, or dial it up, like I've said before, I still maintain this, or dial it up to 11. They make it so extreme. They make the propaganda so extreme, the control so extreme, the disconnection so extreme, the shunning so extreme, that it's just destructive. It just becomes destructive to anybody's good sense and good and livelihood to be part of that activity. With a government, you have a social contract. It's a bit of a different situation, and people have to agree to give up some of their rights or freedoms to live in this society. But if the benefit to them is better in the cost-benefit analysis, then we're not talking about a cult. And that's kind of where I wanted to go with that. So now that I've said my piece, please respond.
Okay, I'm firstly going to go after the word cult.
Cool.
But, for many years, people have walked up to me and said, my brother's involved in this. Is it a cult? And my response to that is it doing them harm?
Right.
Because I think the word cult, which used to be a perfectly serviceable word, which meant a devotion to a particular person or thing. That's what it meant in the dictionary, until I think it was the American Heritage Dictionary decided to redefine it. But up till 1977 in the Oxford, which is the only dictionary that checks all of its words for public usage, 400 public usages before the word goes in with a new meaning. So the word cult changed its meaning in the late 1970s through the media and through cult apologists, people who were being paid money to object. So suddenly this word that just meant being devoted to someone or something, suddenly it became pejorative and negative. So
yep.
You did hear me call the Church of Scientology the mother cult,
Yep.
about 20 minutes ago. I do use the term occasionally, but I don't think it's useful anymore. So let's now move over to a different concept to assess this by. That concept is authoritarianism. Now, authoritarianism is a system among human beings where some of the people believe that they should be in charge and people should do as they're told, and some of the people believe that they can't make decisions, so should do as they're told. At its extreme, when it triumphs, this becomes fascism, Nazism, or the forms of communism that we saw in Russia, China, and various other places, Cuba. I'm going to call it fascism. A new word, totalitarianism, came into being during the 1930s to explain fascism. It meant total authority. So having total authority.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe that there's a division between those of us who believe that society should not be authoritarian, save in times of emergency. If you have to defend your nation against an attack, then you have to have a military where people follow orders.
Yep.
There are police, law enforcement situations where authority is correct. In the US at the moment, we are seeing a hideous misapplication of authority.
Yep.
And it would be great to see that change and to see police officers actually fulfill the oath that I believe they take in the US to serve the people rather
Right.
than to serve one another or anything else. And
Right.
to those many brave, loyal, decent police officers, I take my hat off. It's one of the most difficult jobs you could possibly have. When you get to go and clean up a suicide from a railway track, then you come and tell me that we don't need these people. But
Right.
there is an authoritarian aspect to this. It is a danger within our culture. You talked about Edward Bernays, and we should mention his chief pupil, Joseph Goebbels, who Bernays said, "Oh, he's read my book." And that was the age of radio, where it was much more possible to control people than it is now. But even so, in the new age of radio, we are seeing people being controlled. So we talk really about groups, and we talk really about the source of authority to which somebody pays attention.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument that Bernays put forward was that, of course, we wanted total democracy where everybody's involved in running things. But as yet, people are not educated enough to do that. So we have to use sex, his main weapon, to get them to do what we want. Now, he said that 100 years ago, and we're still not educated or informed enough to be allowed in on the decisions of government. So, $1 trillion was spent by the US based upon the idea that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that he could fire missiles within 25 minutes that would hit somewhere. Well, they would. He could get them to Tel Aviv, in fact. They didn't talk about the $2 billion invested by the CIA into the supergun given to Saddam Hussein, or the 460 million pounds worth of weapons given by the British taxpayer to Saddam Hussein. They didn't give us quite the whole picture. So
Exactly. And that's where the distrust comes from too, which is why there's so much pushback against the authority. You can, what I think where I'm trying to go with some of this in terms of conceptually is that there's this sort of automatic assumption that authority is always bad or always wrong, or any control is wrong or bad. And that only, I think, is symptomatic of betrayal and consistent numbers of betrayals, where the Pentagon Papers, the Vietnam War, right, Nixon, with Watergate. I mean, we went through this tumultuous time in
the torture papers, which Barack Obama refused to release to the public.
That's right.
And
He
refused to dismiss any of the people in the swamp.
That's right.
In fact, Donald Trump has also refused to drain those people from the swamp who permitted torture.
Exactly. So we still have those elements there. And so we go, that needs to go. But then what happens is there's this crossover that happens where, no, it's not the people who are implementing these policies that are wrong. It's not the Dick Cheneys and Donald Rumsfelds of the world that are wrong. It's the system. The system is what's wrong, and we need to tear it down, right? And there's shades of this in BLM and other places. This is as old as the hills, of course, but it's this mental crossover of wrongnesses, betrayals, misinformation, and you see the dissemination of misinformation, you see the propaganda being used. And once you start seeing behind that curtain, like in a cult, it's sort of this awakening moment. You go, oh my God, I didn't realize I was being deceived. I didn't realize they were lying to me. And in a cult, you can just get out. You just go, okay, I'm out of this group. But in a nation, you don't have that option. It's not so easy to just skip out of the country and go, okay, I'm going to be an expat now. That's a little bit of a harder, cookie to eat.
Let's face it. Let's face it. If Trump wins a second term, there are going to be a lot more Canadians.
Yeah, I think that's true. But you get my point. I think it's a logical fallacy to then go, oh, it's the system is bad. All systems are bad. All controls are bad. This is where libertarians go. And it's just like, no, man.
Well,
it's not quite like that. We evolved social hierarchies for a reason. It was a good reason. It got us a lot of places. Let's not just immediately go into it's all awful, as I think where I'm trying to go with that. Nuance is difficult.
I think you've come into a subject which is like the word cult. The first, I believe I'm right in saying that certainly one of the first organizations to be closed down in the United States after Pearl Harbor was the Institute for Propaganda Analysis. And if you go
there was such an institute?
there was such an institute, and if you go to Wikipedia, you will find their definition of propaganda. And the first point is glittering generalities.
Huh.
So it's the first thing you watch for when you're being lied to is a glittering generality. Now, we have just been through a stream of generalities, which I hope I've clarified the word cult. Let's now move to the word authority.
Yeah.
This word becomes, it's like if I say trees, then that gives us some kind of general idea. But if I say, the home oak or the turkey oak or what have you, then we're getting closer in. If I give you a picture of, the variegated Norwegian maple in my garden, then I'm getting more specific. Our great capacity as human beings is to deal in abstractions, but such a problem. Once you said this thing is a cult, then it's a bad thing. Now, let's take the word authority. The word authority has two absolutely distinct meanings. One of them is rank authority. I'm the boss, you do as I tell you, or I fire you. I'm the general, you go on the battlefield or else. I'm the judge, this is the sentence. This is rank authority. Now, it should be based upon expert authority. I know what I'm talking about. I'm the judge, I've studied the law. So if you watch the great film In the Name of the Father about a group of Irish people who were wrongly accused of a bombing in Guildford, and served, I think, 14 years in prison. The judge who sentenced them said that Jerry Conlon, if the death penalty were available to him, he would give the death penalty to Jerry Conlon. Jerry Conlon didn't do anything.
Right.
Other than be a little bit of a petty criminal and a hippie. So you have rank authority, but you also have expert authority. If I want to get my health checked, then I'll probably go to a doctor. It might be better to go to a plumber. So there is expert authority and there's rank authority. So the distrust of authority can be for either of these things. It can be for, and I think that what's happened is that fundamentally what's wrong is corruption. What's wrong in our society is that them as have the money, and I am by no means a Marxist or a communist, call the shots. They, look at the first thing that Barack Obama did, first day as president, was to bring in an executive order saying you cannot work for a lobbyist within, I think it was 2 years of leaving government service, because it had become evident. When John Kerry stood, there was a day when he had a marquee where people came to see him, and I think you had to pay $100,000 to go into that marquee. I've had it with this system. I've absolutely had it with the idea that somebody who, let's face it, has money because if they inherited that money, I'm pretty sure you can actually trace it back to slavery and sugar. That's where the rich became rich. In this country, they controlled the parliament through the rotten borough system, where there'd be two voters who made an MP and they just pay them. So while 400,000 people signed a petition to end slavery in the 18th century, it took actually 50 years before the full abolition in 1834. And then they paid compensation to the people who'd held the slaves, not to the slaves. So, in fact, it was the largest payment ever made in compensation by the British government was to slave owners.
Wow.
So when you look back, you've got these people who got to where they are by, like Carnegie, for example. How many thousands of Chinese laborers died so that Carnegie could make money? So we have this poison in our society where the super rich, and I'm not, differences of income differences of wealth, that doesn't bother me. What bothers me is if I see a squirrel who's gathered enough nuts to feed 10,000 generations of squirrels while there are squirrels around starving. I mean, to me,
Right.
that's
Well,
an
exactly. And
antisocial
that comes
squirrel.
down, doesn't that really come down to a situation of abusive classism?
It comes down to, yes, to an abuse of the absolute notion of democracy, that government of the people, by the people, for the people should not perish in your land. It never existed in your land. It never existed. That when you look at one president after another and the privileges and what went on and the powers that were used, you'll find from time to time they did amazing things. I'm a big fan of FDR.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly of the people he gathered around him. That was his skill, that he did great fireside chats and they did the work to try and create a more equal society, a society in which, it's meant to be a Christian society in America, a society in which people would be fed, a society in which people would be clothed and housed, and moved out of the Hoovervilles that they were cardboard cities they were living in when FDR became president. Teddy Roosevelt tried the trust busting laws to stop this way of passing on massive fortunes from one
Mm-hmm.
generation to the next. It failed. The New Deal was overcome by the National Association of Manufacturers, who gave us the slogan, the American way. That's where it comes from. It's an advertising slogan, not actually a constitutional right. And they were assisted by the family, the International Christian League, the Fellowship,
Right.
whichever name.
Right. Well, see, the thing about factions and about groups of individuals who have power is that you're not gonna, the way our whole world is structured.
You think our world is structured?
The way our minds are structured, let's put it that way. Hey, thanks, Couch, and this earlier one as well on the super chats there, guys. Thanks. I'll try to keep up with, yes, Freddie, the Sort, and Danielle. Thank you very much, guys. Our systems try to compensate for all the problems you are laying out right now. And they compensate for them to greater or lesser degrees of efficacy and effectiveness, right?
Fairly low degrees of efficacy and effectiveness.
Well, that's the thing, though, isn't it? So when you're living it, it feels very oppressive. And on a historical view, you can look at it and go, okay, the US system, for example, is the first time that we have had. I mean, I suppose what's evolved in Britain might be a runner-up for this, as far as a system where there are checks and balances, where unlimited power doesn't exist in any branch of this three-branch government, and they can rein each other in as necessary when things get out of control. The rich have always been in charge. Going back to Rome, to Greece, to Egypt. I mean, that's just how it is. We can't make a society where that doesn't happen.
Well, Athens and the invention of democracy did make a society of a sort where every male in the society who was not a slave had a vote. There was no Senate, not like the Roman government, and there was no archon. That's the title that they used for the head of government. So they did vote on all issues. I'm not sure that that's the best way to go. They also kept.
It didn't last that long, as I understand it. It was only a short-lived thing comparatively.
How long has the US lasted? Take a comparison. It went.
Oh no, I think
it lasted for longer than the time between now and the Declaration of Independence.
I don't know that that's true. My information, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But my information was
the Honey and the Hemlock. Read The Honey and the Hemlock by Ellie Sager, which is a detailed book on the subject. The period begins in 600 BC with the Archon Solon, and there are variants of it until eventually Philip and his son Alexander, more famous son Alexander, over Greece under the Macedonians. But that there is a period, of some time where this system is developing, And
Yeah.
it's an oppressive system. I'm not suggesting, because they had slaves, women had
Well, that's
women,
the thing. Women didn't have a voice. I mean, so
but
to
it was
modern
not
values,
the
it's
rule by the
barbarism,
rich.
right?
So even if it only lasted 10 minutes, that
Okay.
it's possible. What's more,
Yeah.
our tribal societies with a chieftain, you know, God appoints the king. I think it's
Yeah.
Romans 13 that the family used to say, well, your leader was appointed by God, so Stalin was approved by God, so you got to do what he says, you know, which is incredibly intelligent. Thank you so much.
Right.
But there are
Exactly.
societies, again, Elie Sagan, at the dawn of tyranny, where he talks about the San of the Kalahari, commonly insulted as Bushmen, and the Ba'aka, the pygmies of the African rainforest.
Mhm.
These are people who don't have tribal leaders. It's not part of, so it's
But it's
not.
few and far between, isn't it?
Yeah, but,
It's the
you
exception,
only
not the
need
rule.
one exception to test the rule.
Well, I
If
know, I understand, but rules exist because they cover the broad spectrum of experience where you have exceptions that you can point to and go, good, let's take a look at why that's happening. And if it's a good exception, let's see if we can bolster it. But human nature through time and has absolutely been in a direction of, I want a leader, I want to follow, I don't want to think about what to do, I want you to make those decisions. Whether that's the Bolsheviks in Russia, whether it was Genghis Khan in Mongolia, or whether it was the founding fathers in America, people naturally put authority in higher figures. Generally speaking, that's the form of governments that we create.
yeah,
Especially once you move beyond the tribal, once you move beyond the size. I think scale matters here because small groups can have libertarian systems in place where everybody knows each other, gets along. I mean, mining towns were perfect examples of this as America grew. That's a libertarian system where it works. People can self-regulate, they figure things out. But once you get it beyond a certain size, you have to start investing authority in regulatory bodies because it gets beyond the ability of any one person to be able to think their way through who's putting out the fires today, who's taking care of that bum today, who's what happens when Joe shoots Bill in the street because he gets
let me
pissed at,
continue the idea of the non-tribal societies.
Yeah.
And we will first of all take apart the Latin, by the way. The exception proves the rule. Yep.
Uh-huh.
Well, it doesn't. Provare doesn't mean prove, it means test. Okay.
Okay.
So
Cool.
I'm not saying that you said it, I'm just saying that it's a commonplace thought. The exception doesn't prove the rule. These two exceptions are extremely important. These societies have existed for centuries,
Mm-hmm.
but this is the way they do it. They don't have a boss who tells them what to do, who's usually the thug who tells you who you're going to attack in the typical Whoever is best at doing something within that community leads the community at that thing. Okay, let's move from that idea to what you
sort
said.
of a true meritocracy, expertness sort of thing.
Yes, and it works very well in
Mm-hmm.
our societies. If you want to see happy, watch documentaries about the Ba'aka and the San. These are people who, although they've been massively oppressed, actually have vibrant communities. They like it.
How large are they? Just so I'll know, so I can think with what I'm talking about.
In societies of hundreds of people, maybe breaking into the 1,000 or what have you. They're very small, but they have maintained their societies without warfare and with a minimum of problems.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is that notion that authority is therefore always expert authority in their communities. It's not, I'm the warlord and I'm going to thump you if you don't do what you're told. Might is right, as you say. It's you have that expertise. If we then move over to the Dunbar number, the idea that a community can sustain up to about 150 people, that 150 people can know each other and work together. When you go beyond that number, it would appear difficulties. And you then invert the pyramid of democracy. And you say, why don't we have a communitarian system whereby decisions are made by 150 people that then go up to a larger number, so that you have communities that can discuss, like the virtual Taiwan system at the moment online, where people can talk with the government about proposals and come to a supermajority where they agree that the government has made the right decision. So this happened over electric scooters, where there was a 50-50 divide in Taiwan over whether they should be legal. And they had an online discussion which led to the decision that if there was safety equipment, a speed limit, and insurance, that the supermajority, 2/3 of people, agreed that it could happen. Many things could be decided that way. And you know, if you have blockchain voting and safer systems than the US has at the moment, then you can actually start to get consensus among people about what should go on. And you can
Now, if I'm understanding what you're saying right, then this would be a fairly modern take on this, because we're utilizing technology that's only a couple decades old in order to accomplish this.
Yeah.
I would put forward it would be damn near impossible to accomplish this sort of a thing with a large scale society prior to the invention of that technology.
Yeah, so
luckily
we are
the
not
closest thing we've got, right? Voting.
Luckily, we're not going to get in a time machine and go backwards and try and apply this to the past. I'm thinking about the future mainly here.
Good, cool,
and
cool.
It is something it's concerned me since I was a teenager. The notion that you know, at the moment in this country, 90% of the rich are descended from people who 100 years ago were rich. Right. 90% of them.
Right. I hate that.
Yeah.
I haven't figured out how to, within the value system I grew up in, I haven't figured out a real good solution for that. I mean, because it's sort of like, okay, you don't get to inherit. Like, okay. Or you only get to inherit a certain amount. Okay, how does that work? Like it's a kind of a tough problem given our value set.
Yeah, and it's a matter of really of changing the attitude of the culture. Now, among the Plains Indians, generosity was considered to be the greatest value. As you go up north towards the Tlingit and the people around Vancouver, it gets stupid, because at their potlatches, they would give all their stuff to another tribe to show how generous they were. But as you move down through the plains, if you went buffalo hunting with the Lakota or the Cheyenne, or the Ponca, let's put the Ponca in there as well, because we love them, or the Omaha, or any of these peoples in that strip, then it was expected that if you killed more buffalo than anybody else, you gave them all away. That made you a respected person in the community because of your generosity. This meant that when they were herded onto reservations and given the smallpox blankets, of course, God bless America, that when white folks came along, carpetbaggers came along saying, oh, I wonder if you'd give me that horse, they would give things away because they had a basic notion of generosity, which is absolutely opposed to the alcohol-ridden community of the Europeans.
That's right.
So,
and that goes back to quite a ways in terms of European value set, selfishness, individual over group. We see that manifest in a number of ways. The example you just gave is a perfect example. Two cultures come together. One has this, fairly selfish value set. The other has a more generous, let's be aware of everybody. It's a we, not me situation. Europeans come at it with a me, not we. And that, I keep returning to that as a base philosophy or base worldview of these clashing cultures. And I think we're both talking about the fact that it would be better if we could somehow get the West more on board with the philosophy of we, not me.
Yeah, more the way that Asians think about.
Yeah, that is the difference. The reductionist difference between East and West is East is more we, not me. They have a real culture, familial mostly. I think it really revolves around family more so than the larger culture. But it's this awareness of group being important. And, it's funny to me, this really hit me square in the eyes when I heard a special forces guy, a guy who used to be a Navy SEAL, he was on Rogan, talking about BUDS training, the basic underwater demolition training that they do in order to become a Navy SEAL.
Bloods training.
And,
Is that how to smoke marijuana?
yeah, no, it's underwater demolition specialist training. It's the school you got to go to. It's the stuff that they show in the movies. Everybody's like, ooh, it looks so tough, and it is. But then this guy who became a BUDS trainer, and is now on the other side of it. He goes through it. It's hell. It breaks him down like it does everybody. And you go through these various things. But then he said, when you get around to the other side of it and you become the educator, you become the person who's running the program, you come to realize that the entire point of that program, or one of the key pillars of that program, is, and what they're trying to weed out and get into these people's heads, is that they need to come to a realization that it's we, not me, when it comes to their Navy SEAL team and what they're doing for their country, for their unit, for the mission. And they have to break that me, not we mindset that every Western person who goes into this group, because of course, by definition, it's going to be people who are Americans who are going into this, they have to break that, and they don't even necessarily say it out loud, but that's what they're doing, is they're putting you through this hellacious individual experience. But actually, it's not an individual experience. You're with a team, and the team doesn't make it if you don't contribute to the team. So you have to learn that. And I think that if we could adjust our value set just a little bit, then we could really achieve some greatness, as a country or as a culture, if we could bust out of that selfishness, And I think that just getting back to just to comment on what I just said in relation to the actual subject that we started this all on, I think that if people could see that they are part of a larger whole that is actually something they contribute to and that contributes back to them, and if that was true, right? And it is true, but if it was more true or more evidently true, then we would get rid of a lot of this, I think the government is a destructive cult kind of thinking, but it takes a lot more. I'm not just talking about changing people's minds at the lowest levels of the society. These things we talk about, have been talking about this whole hour, have been about the reasons people have a hard time busting out of that mindset, because they are lied to. They are deceived. They are controlled in bad ways. They are made to pay for taxes that are stupid. They are made to put up with stuff that comes down that's really oppressive stuff, especially with the minorities, right?
Enormous waste of money.
Huge. But I also believe that there is an attitude adjustment that does need to occur at the lowest levels, too, of our society in order for us to accomplish this massive reform we want at the top. We have to kind of change our attitude a little bit about it too.
Well, I mean, Ira Chala's courageous followership and his intelligent disobedience are very good places to start on those. Right. But I see I
plugged this last time. I think I plugged this book last week, actually. Intelligent Disobedience, Ira Chala. This is good stuff. Yeah, exactly.
We'll wave our. I've actually got the proof edition. Look at this.
Oh,
the proof edition of the Courageous Follower.
Nice.
Yes. Beat that.
Yeah. Because I think we have to rise to the occasion too, as citizens. Is all I'm trying to say. You know what I mean?
Everybody has to rise to the occasion.
The informed electorate is a thing, and if we're all just low information voters, we kind of get the government we sort of deserve. I mean, I don't want to put it all on the citizens. That's not my point. You guys know that. It's just we need to rise to the occasion as well, is I guess kind of what I'm trying to put there.
And let's pull together. That we started talking about propaganda, which by the way is a snarl word in the Protestant world and a purr word in the Catholic world that invented it. So Bernays insisted that there is no such thing as public relations. There is only propaganda. Now, we had something that happened here. In the 1970s, the then Prime Minister James Callaghan, the leader of our Labour Party, said that the Labour Party would never employ a public relations agency. At the same time, the Conservative Party, led by Margaret Thatcher, employed Saatchi and Saatchi, and a man who is now a Lord Tim Bell, is said to have spent the next 11 years largely lying on the rug in her office, thinking up the next way to say something. Now, these people have always been there. Machiavelli was a spin doctor. That was his, though he never got a job, of course. He wrote the discourses and he wrote the prince, but nobody wanted to employ him because he was obviously a shitbag. But a very interesting thinker.
Mm-hmm.
What happened was that politics under Reagan and Thatcher moved into spin. When the Clinton campaign happened, a man called Philip Gould, who represented the new Labour Party, which was basically no longer a socialist party, but an aspect of the Conservative Party, very confusing piece of politics. Philip Gould was on the bus all the way through the Clinton tour, and he advised Tony Blair how to get power. Tony Blair then employed a whole series of spin doctors, Alistair Campbell as his principal advisor, Derek Draper, Philip Gould, Peter Mandelson, who the architect of New Labour. And these guys worked out what the people wanted to hear. Now, the first campaign speech I saw when they were going for election in 97, my jaw dropped as somebody who's been studying propaganda for a lifetime. I couldn't believe that they were using the most obvious tricks possible.
Mm-hmm.
And we then wind forward and you look at Cambridge Analytica, Aggregate IQ, their sister organization, also funded by Robert Mercer, Donald Trump's chief, the man who contributed most to the Trump campaign. These organizations said, how about if we can get people who don't normally register to vote because we annoy them so much? And we lost our membership of the European Union solely because of this campaign to take back control. I've got my little sign behind me. This is Dominic Cummings, the man who came up with it. And this is Boris Johnson as a chicken, as made by my son, who sees Boris Johnson that way. Take back control. This slogan managed to get people to vote with no idea what the European Parliament, the European Commission, or the European Council are, with no idea what the economic effect would be, with the lie that we would get £350 million every week to spend on our National Health Service because we wouldn't be paying it to the European Union. We never have paid that amount. It was a complete fiction made up by Dominic Cummings. So I think that what's happened is that it used to be that the spin doctors sat behind the politicians. There was a guy he got 500 hours of feeds because you realize that when the cameras are on and somebody's being interviewed in Florida, they leave the feed open to California and New York and you can get it. So he got the stuff that wasn't being broadcast. So you get these astonishing things where you've got, the President of the United States, George Bush Sr. at the time, sat there having a conversation with Larry King about how much halcyon they both take. Now, this drug is illegal in the rest of the world because its side effect is psychosis. And you've got the President of the US saying, I take 6 a day, it keeps me awake. Then you realize that underneath the table in many of these interviews, there's a guy telling him what to say. So what's happened is, and that's in the early 90s. What's happened is that the spin doctors have taken over the asylum. And the idea is, how do you make us look better? How do we get voted back in 4 years' time? The standard.
See, that's where I wanted to actually go with this, right? And I'm glad you're going straight there like a rocket, right? Which is that the propaganda machines that operate right now operate independent of the governments and can sway public opinion for or against government itself. Government issues, things to vote on, but they can also sway against the government system itself. And we have seen a very effective campaign waged for decades in the United States against the very system of our government. Not a value, not an individual politician, not even an equal rights or human rights matter, but the system. The system's what's wrong, and we have to tear it down. And that skews perception so badly that you think the government's a cult. You know, in the common parlance, right? The cult is bad. It's a bad group. High control, authoritarian. You know, when you're actually being fed a whole bunch of conflicting, crazy messages from so many different sources, and they are so powerful now. You know, Cambridge Analytica is a great example. The Russian internet media service or internet service, whatever the hell they call that thing that they're operating out of.
APT 28.
Yeah, I mean, what they got going, what China has going on right now. I mean, these
what
are
America's got going that is not being talked about because they've got 5 times as much. You know,
only very, very recently have they put that together. Only very recently, right? In response to what the Russians and the Chinese have been doing for
Snowden's back doors were in place before we found out anything. Before the Trump campaign started, the Snowden back doors were already in. Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, had her phone hacked by.
It's fair enough. I'm not gonna sit here and defend the U.S. government's cyber, operations. I'm just saying that a lot of, according to what I've read, the offensive measures put together within the United States intelligence community on cyber was mostly done in the last decade, and we were behind what the Russians and the Chinese were doing. Now, if I'm wrong about that, fine, I'm wrong. I'm just saying what I've read. So I'm not saying there was no activity, and I'm certainly not saying that I used to go down those conspiracy rabbit holes all the way. I know the NSA is not a great bunch of guys.
No, and as we said earlier, the CIA actually performed torture, which had absolutely no helpful effect, and the people that ran that were allowed to continue. That, I think, is a huge part of the problem. When people rail against the establishment or the system, they're railing against the inequality, the injustice, and the deception. You earlier on said a government has to you have to manipulate people. Those were your exact words. You then said manipulate might not be the right word. It isn't. Manipulation means to deceive somebody.
You're right. But then again, what do you do with a population of people who are so bombarded with false information from 20 different sources on a daily basis and are so goddamn confused that they don't know what to think?
Teach them.
What do you do with that population?
You first of all send them to Wikipedia to read the Institute for Propaganda Analysis's points explaining how you can very easily see when somebody is, using BS. You know me, I'm down to just a few simple basics. You teach people what a human predator looks like. I had an astonishing conversation quite by accident the other week with a very senior psychiatrist, a government advisor. And he doesn't wish to be named because he can't say anything without a written permission from a cabinet secretary, right? Yeah. But I sent him to my one page on the Human Predator, the Open Minds Foundation website. And to my amazement, he's a senior psychiatrist. And I always, with these guys, expect he's going to come back and say, oh, you are so wrong about that. And he just came back and agreed. And when I said that the Hare psychopathy checklist revised should be used on all people who seek political office, he just agreed with me. And he also agreed with me when I said, of course, intelligent psychopaths will get through it. But fortunately, most politicians aren't very intelligent. So we could, and that screening, I'm told that in the US, I don't know if it's true, the empathy quotient is now being used to test police officers, candidates.
Yeah, I hope so. I was just about to say, I hope that sounds a perfect tool for that.
It is a perfect tool, and if you are high empathy, you don't get the job.
I know, and that's a little bit weird. That's
That's
I
very.
had a whole conversation with another guy about that exact point who had gone through it,
But
and it was shocking that it is backwards.
we have instruments already that
Yeah,
could be used. So
yeah,
if you teach the population how to recognize predators, you know, that guy that comes up to you you never met before is like, hey, wow, it's wonderful to see you. You
yeah,
know, there are easy ways of spotting this. I've got something to sell you.
yeah, exactly.
And if you then teach the basic techniques, and again, I reduce the conditions of the predator to 1 page, the methods and techniques to 2. These are things that any teenager and every teenager should know, because then you start going, what's going on here? Why are they doing this? Transparency and honesty in government.
Mm-hmm.
These are buzzwords that were introduced by the spin doctors.
I know,
Transparency.
and kind of what I'm talking about with the problem here is it's an enormous problem. You know, I'm all about education. You know, I want people better educated in critical thinking, in what propaganda is, how to spot it. Law of probability in the comments says, you know, John Atack might overestimate the ease of identifying propaganda. The KGB and related agencies had departments tasked with creating forged documents to support their claims.
Well, yeah.
I mean, I think that's true of all government agencies, not just the KGB. But I think that is part of the problem, is that we've been aware of propaganda as a technique or technology, or however you want to put it, for the last 100 years. So the counterintelligence techniques are also in play.
Would you like to tell me what happened to the KGB again?
Well,
So
see, I'm still alive and well.
they don't exist anymore. But they showed the KGB shows the nub of the problem, which is that the Russian intelligence was always far superior to Western intelligence. They had 5 people in our MI6, our external agency equivalent of CIA, including the head of the Russia desk, Kim Philby. They had 1 guy, George Blake, in our MI5. They ran the French service. Now, Charles Ames is the only name that is usually flagged for the CIA, but it had 19 other people in the CIA, right? So once you start running these little agencies, there is a differentiation. One side is the professors, the defectors, the news guys who give you the information about a place. And that we vitally need, that intelligence we need. The other side is the spooks. And that's still the history of, the way that we imported not simply war criminal scientists from Nazi Germany, like Werner von Braun, the head of NASA. We also imported SS regiments. The US got the Byelorussia one, and the UK got the Ukrainian one. They were used to perform sabotage operations in the USSR during the 1950s. The war was not as cold as it seems. The spooks and what they're up to, this whole background thing of we've got to do this thing because otherwise, the analysts at the CIA in 1958, I think it was, looked at Vietnam and said, you cannot win a war in Vietnam because the people don't want you there. They want, after the oppression of the French, preceded by the oppression of the Chinese, they want their own place now. If you're friendly with them, they hate the Chinese, and Mao will never have an influence. That was the analysts. The spook department went, let's make the golden triangle so everyone in the world can have heroin. We've seen this corruption that is at the very top of our governments, and it getting in, there's ethical and unethical persuasion. And
that's where I was going with the manipulation earlier.
Exactly.
The persuasion is probably the better word for what I was thinking of there.
Yeah, in ethical persuasion, you give somebody all of the information, and you might give it to them in a particular sequence so that they can, better assimilate it, and so that your argument is more persuasive. in unethical persuasion, you hold back some of the information. And
yeah, it's a tricky thing there when it gets to governments. This is actually a point I wanted to bring up because I want to bring this right back to this question. Are governments just destructive cults? Because we're not off in the woods, but we are talking about difficult aspects of this. So let's bring it back to that, right? Because I mentioned before, informed populace, you can't really have a great, democracy without that. And exactly what you just said, you want to let everybody in on what the hell's going on. Yet you also have the very real reality in our world of state secrets and spooks and spies and influences and
militarism.
World leaders like Kim Jong-un, right, or the guy in China, Xi, right, is you can't tell everybody everything because these guys are listening too. And there are things that they don't need to know about, or there's things that we don't necessarily need to know about. But I will say, having said my little piece about, there are some state secrets that have to stay secret, I think the level with which we inform our populace right now is way, way, way too low. I think we need to bring it way up. And we need to be much more honest. I've been most disappointed in our presidents and our congressmen to a degree, but mostly the presidents, for their lack of informing people what the hell's actually going on and what's behind the decision-making processes of what they're doing. I think they could be much more candid and open about a lot of things. And so I guess I'm agreeing with you, but I just wanted to put that little state secret in there because I don't know that you can tell everybody everything, but I think you can tell them a lot more than we're being told.
No, what I said was that ethical persuasion consists of revealing all the information. You don't need to ethically persuade people of what our intelligence about other nations is. That's a different department altogether.
Yeah, just why we do things in the world at large, though, I guess is where I was going with that. I've had a lot of attention on foreign affairs for the last couple of weeks because I've been reading. I finally finished Bolton's book, and it was just like, oh my God. Seeing the world through somebody who worked at the NSA or worked at the National Security Director. I mean, I don't agree with Bolton. I don't like Bolton. The guy is like this warmonger. But it was such an interesting education looking at the world through that guy's eyes.
Of course.
And finding out some of the considerations as to what they're thinking with and thinking about when they're making decisions. But then what you end up hearing at the public level, what Trump or the politicians say as to why they're doing what they're doing versus why they're actually doing what they're doing is night and day sometimes. And I agree completely with you that we need to be better informed as to the real reasons that,
we need to be able to better assess material. And let me pick up the point that was made about the forgery of documents. There is a very famous document that was forged by the Cheka, whatever they were called at the time, the FSB, the NKVD. They've had lots of names over the years, but the Russian secret police under the Tsar felt they had a particular problem. And so they created a manuscript called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Oh, yeah, that thing, yeah.
Now, as far as forgeries go, there's a wonderful book by Norman Cohn called Warrant for Genocide. And Cohn is one of the great historians of the last century, wrote Pursuit of the Millennium about the crusading movements, Europe's Inner Demons, about the witchcraft, the witch trials. A remarkable historian. But he takes apart the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And the most bizarre thing about this is that it was actually first published as a critique of Napoleon III of France by a man who was found guilty of having written the book. Copies of it exist in Swiss libraries going back into the 1860s. And all that's happened is that a Checker guy in a rush crossed out certain words and put the word Zionist in. Now, that book was written before the term Zionist was adopted by Jews, which was in the 1870s, I believe. It was a term it was actually English Puritans who really wanted Zionism and pushed for 300 years to get the Jews to accept it, because until such time as the Jews go back to Jerusalem and are Zion and are converted to Christianity, Jesus can't come back. And that's really led to some weird things, like Ord Wingate, being instructed by the British government to train Jewish settlers in Palestine to commit terrorist acts. They were trained in them by a man who would later become famous for his Burmese campaign in World War II. He was a member of the Plymouth Brethren, who believe got to get the Jews back to Zion so that they can convert. But the point is that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a forged document is a forged document. As somebody who's had to analyze literally hundreds of thousands of documents, you put them in a context frame.
Yep.
So when Ian Camacho said that the term CE that L. Ron Hubbard added to his name before PhD in many places in the 1950s, that Hubbard had never claimed that it meant civil engineer, and that it was the Church of Scientology that had claimed this, I immediately sent him an interview for the Australian press produced by L. Ron Hubbard, in which he says, you look to who's who in the South and Southwest, and you'll find my biography, which claims that he has a BS, and I think that is accurate, not a BSc, in Civ Engring. And that is what it says. I am quoting exactly. Civ Engring, not civil engineering, Civ Engring. Camacho came back to me and said, this document isn't in my friend's collections. And I'm going, well, I've got 60 bankers' boxes of Scientology documents. How many have you got? But it's not in his friend's collection, so it can't be trusted. So we then got a letter from the Anderson Inquiry where Hubbard has handwritten on it, that the accounts in who's who in the South and Southwest, which of course you paid to have put in there, are reasonably accurate. And Camacho came back and said, yeah, he says reasonably. And I go back and say, no, inaccurate and reasonably accurate are not the same thing. We finally, and Tony Ortega published it, found a letter was found where Hubbard claimed he'd been a civil engineer. But so you put documents in context, you find, do they fit with other documents? And occasionally, you'll find things like the Zimmerman telegram in World War I, where an intelligence agency may or may not have created a document saying that Mexico was just ready to join the First World War, and that tipped the balance. So there is a lot of that going on. But the problem is, I would say that 90% of the time you can tell whether something's forged or not. But you relate it to other witnesses, other sources, and you look at what the interest is. If you look at the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, their simple statement. I wrote to the great Anthony Pratt-Karnis a couple of years ago because I wanted to write something about propaganda, and I said, would the Institute for Propaganda Analysis list still be useful? And I thought, this is Anthony Pratt-Karnis, the editor of Influence magazine, the co-author of Age of Propaganda, one of the best books, one of the two best books, Stuart Ewan's PR is the other one, that I've read about PR. And I thought, he'll put me right. He'll say, that was 1938, John, and there's all this stuff. And he wrote back and he said, it's fantastic still.
Yeah.
Better yet, in Age of Propaganda, he and Aronson give a list of points you can use. And you start noticing it. You start seeing how the manipulation happens because the people doing it are using the same textbooks. So,
right.
It's all there. All the rah-rah political rallies. We're the best people who ever lived. Make America great again.
Right.
Which year was it great in? What are we aiming for?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that whole thing is just a thought-stopping cliche. Make America great.
So teach people not to respond to things that are directly emotionally aimed at them. When somebody says, hey, you're a fantastic person, and of course you are, Chris, don't believe them.
Right.
Say, what are you selling me? Is it a religion?
Exactly.
Is it because you want to have sex with me? Is it, and then sadly not, people don't, but
damn it.
Let's move on from there.
Let's move on. Exactly.
Very quickly.
So can we differentiate? Because we're really off on propaganda, and this is and I'm glad, because this is one important part of what I wanted to talk about. can we differentiate those mechanisms and organizations of propaganda from a government structure? Can these two things be considered separately, or are they hopelessly intertwined in such a way that there is no way to consider one without the other?
Okay.
Because I think we can.
I think we can. And there's a rule that I would like to see, which is
Mm-hmm.
that when a politician says something on the floor of our house or the floor of your Senate or your house, if it
Mm-hmm.
is proved that they knew that what they said was not true, they should be barred from political office for 5 years from that day. Now, I'll give
I think
you
that is a fascinatingly good idea.
yeah, that when a lawyer goes into court in this country, they are under oath. They don't take an oath. Anything they say is under oath. And if therefore it can be shown that they lied to the court, they lose their certificate of practice. So I
Right.
see that standard first of all. I'm going to give you an example. When in the Falklands War, the
Mm-hmm.
Belgrano was sunk with a loss, I think, of 500 lives. Margaret Thatcher, our Prime Minister, stood up and when asked, was it inside the exclusion zone, lied. She knew it was a lie because she'd given the order to sink it. There was a zone around the Falklands the Argentines were not meant to go into. It wasn't there. Now, she lied to the House. For me, that's the end. We
Yep.
start promoting truthfulness. We start promoting transparency and honesty. There's a thing called the Stetson effect, named for a member of the famous hat company who was opposed to racism. And he said, look, you can have a situation where you dare not speak out against some racist, but don't smile when they say something to you. Have a frown on your face. Do the least thing you can. Let's develop a culture that honors whistleblowers. It's time, that you shouldn't lose everything because you stood up against.
God damn, is that certainly true?
Let's make
Because I wonder, why aren't more people stepping up? Well, look what happens when you do.
Yeah.
You get ruined.
Yeah, you just watch the film The Insider with Russell Crowe and you see what happens when somebody tells the truth about tobacco industry.
That's right. Look what happened to the guy with the report, the torture report.
Yeah.
I mean, they just go after you relentlessly when you're trying to be a truth teller, when you're trying to just say, here's what happened, or here's the situation.
It's like speaking out against Scientology.
Yeah. And to that degree, it's people start going, hey, this is like a cult. The mechanisms are like a cult, but I don't think the structure of what we're talking about is. And that's why I want to differentiate the propaganda machinations from the structure of what we're talking about. We don't have a society that doesn't have some kind of system of government when you're talking about millions of people. You can talk about small tribes, you can talk about small groups of people in a libertarian way or in a more, sort of egalitarian, sort of everybody's on the same page and everybody's getting along and it's all good. But you scale that up and it doesn't scale so well. You have to have methods of communication. You have to have representatives because there's just too many goddamn people, And so government becomes a necessity. It's not by definition a destructive cult apparatus, but what I wanted to point out here is that it uses some of the same mechanisms, and so they can become confused. And I guess that's the theme of where I was going with this.
I mean, my whole thing, from once I'd published "Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky," which was 30 years ago. 30 years ago. I started looking at, I'd looked at lots of other so-called cult groups like the Moonies and the Krishnas and the Way International and what have you, and seen that the same psychological dynamics applied. So I started looking at terrorism through the early 90s. I started looking at gangs, human trafficking, pedophile grooming. And I realized that, hey, it's not that I used to belong to this group, which is a unique experience. These are the ways of tricking people. These are the ways of, the emotionalism, the giving people peak experiences. Scientology is totally geared towards giving you very good indicators. And I had somebody recently who told me that I ought to, who's an ex-member, who told me that I ought to design this thing for 15-year-olds, and if it gave them very good indicators, then I should export it. And it's like, well, if it makes you high, then you've learned something. Not at all. That is, the idea of that is wrong. If you can go and apply it and give me an example of how you applied it, then I'll believe you've learned it. But if I teach, if I'm showing you a thing about how to fix a car and you go, yeah, wow, I got it now, I'm not really convinced, So, but I see corruption as fundamental, that integrity should be really valued in our society. If we're going to put up statues, let's put them up to people who 99% of the time did the right thing, And I have a lot of questions here which get me into trouble. So, for example, Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela represents what people would like to think of a hero. But Nelson Mandela pardoned his wife for the murder of Stumpy McKechnie, who was...
I mean, I don't know any of these people. I know Mandela. I don't know anything else about it. So
his wife, Winnie, while he was on Robben Island, was running what was called the Football Club, which committed a series of murders. There are two forms. One is the tire burning, where you put somebody in a stack of tires and put petroleum, gasoline in it, set fire to them. And the other one is the death by 1,000 cuts, where you have them in a yard that they can't escape from and slash them every time they run by you. I think McKechnie suffered death in the second way. He decided to pardon her. I don't get that. So we want to make this black and white. Oh dear, and black and white really does work in this. We want to make this world of good and evil somehow. And yet we recognize that that's a cultic way of thinking, that there are shades of grey, more than 50 of them, and quite a lot of colours too. And we have to open the debate out from the polarization. And this is, in the UK, it's a polarization over Europe. Half of us wanted to stay, half of us wanted to leave. In the US, it's the Confederate flag. No, in the US, there's this terrible divide that does seem to go back possibly to the Civil War. It's never really been healed. And it is about people getting together and saying, moving forward, what would be a sensible way of doing this? Now, Karl Marx, contrary to popular opinion, was an anarchist. He put forward communism as a way towards having no government at all. Because if everybody's nice and loving and looking after everybody else, you don't need a government. Well, you need an organization, but you don't need a government. But the point is, until and unless we can take the predators out of the system and find some way to treat them and help them, not to burn them at the stake, but until we can take power away from those who have no self, the narcissists, who desperately need the adulation of the masses or their family or what have you, those transformations and transitions, which are none of them within our educational system at the moment. Give me 40 minutes with a teenager and I'll teach them a toolkit that will show them how to be taken in much less often, how to be abused much less often. That 40 minutes is not available to me under the current system. So we have the internet, and we can subvert everything by getting people to join in and say, rather than the gurus, Chris Shelton and John Atack, in the new society, we're all gurus. We're all, we have our own expertise, and we're allowed to develop it, and we're allowed to participate. And we don't need somebody to tell us what to think and tell us what to do. We do need to learn how to think and to learn how to do, to going forward. And I think we can. I'm tremendously optimistic seeing, things like laughtivism, the movement to laugh at authority when it's doing things, and they can't.
That's right. Oh, actually, that reminds me. I wanted to run this by you. I think there are two things that are the antidote for bad ideas. Humor
Yes.
and better ideas.
Yeah.
And and those two things seem to be the target of an awful lot of people right now. A lot of people seem to be targeting humor and free speech, which is why I brought it up at the get-go, right? Because if we want to counter these bad ideas that are being propagandized or being pushed forward, being pushed on us, regardless of the source, regardless of where it's coming from. I don't care if it's coming from, the Russian GRU or the Chinese, whatever the hell their spy agency is called, because it's so good nobody even knows what it's called. Or
APT-10 is the label that's been given to it, but there you go.
What is it?
APT-10.
APT-10. Good.
They invaded all the universities of the world and gathered all of the information. I kid you not.
I tell you, man, they're pretty good.
Yeah.
Or the CIA, or whatever, or Cambridge Analytica, or Madison Avenue, or wherever it comes from. If we had the tool set individually to be able to deal with that with humor and with better ideas and the freedom to communicate those things, then there's really no cult. Then it's really just a wild, back and forth of ideas that we can actually argue and hash out and deal with.
And let me make a differentiation about humor here, that within authoritarian groups, humor means ridicule.
Mm-hmm.
Hubbard talking about psychiatrists. Mm-hmm. Or I went to, when I was 17, a friend of mine took me to a Christadelphian meeting, and they were lovely people. But somebody said something about Darwin and monkeys, and the whole room just burst out laughing. And it was sort of, I'm thinking that they haven't really considered the idea of natural selection by random mutation. That there are targets that are ridiculed, laughed at. This is part of the induction of aversion, disgust in people. Something that's, people talk about phobia induction, they talk about guilt induction, but they don't get into the aversion part. The aversion part is what allows genocide. It allows you to say, our opponents are fleas, rats, what have you. They're not human. As an Australian general told his troops when killing Japanese, they're just money.
That's right. But at the flip side of
that's not humor. That's
no, I get that. And the flip side of that would be satire.
And satire can be harsh and extreme, but there's also humor, which is just of itself being light-hearted about things, not wanting to kill your opponent, but wanting to embrace your opponent. Wanting to,
You hope it would come from a place like that. But I'll tell you, I would rather ridicule white supremacists all day than have them cloistered in basements talking to each other about things I don't know what they're talking about, because we've pushed them all into a basement or something. You know what I mean?
I want people to be talking, and that's vital. But I think that where we're talking up hate and talking up vitriol and negative emotion, that that, as I say, there are words used on white nationalist sites, and they are calling themselves white nationalists now, not white supremacists. I was told off for calling somebody a conspiracy theorist. I didn't realize it was a negative term, but he was most offended. But he still believes in chemtrails, and he's an anti-vaxxer and what have you. But so words have become so precious. But looking at white nationalist sites, I do think there should be some restriction upon terms of abuse and inciting people to hatred. And we have that enshrined in law here. But there should not be, any limit upon what we're allowed to believe. Somebody tells me, no Jews were killed in the Second World War. They all committed suicide or something like that. I want a conversation if I can have it. Usually I can't, because the information I present, like, well, why did the camp commandant, Rudolf Höss from Auschwitz, say that he had executed and exterminated 1.25 million people? And why did his deputy support him in that statement? Oh, he must have been tortured. Eventually Occam's razor is what will deal with propaganda, that you have to stack up the facts and go, well, there are 180,000 testimonials from people who are involved in this. You find me whether the Battle of Waterloo actually happened. You find me that many witness accounts of the Battle of Waterloo. They don't exist. And in fact, in France, Germany, and Britain, you'll read 3 different accounts of that battle. And I go with the German one, by the way. I think Blucher and the Prussians won the battle, not Wellington. But I'm now going to be beaten up when I go out on the street here. People have, how dare you say that about the Duke of Wellington? But
well, you know, though, that is it's a difficult, you know, the free speech thing is a difficult morass, because you want to prevent the hate speech, you want to prevent, which is itself a very, very difficult to define term, because what is today's love is tomorrow's hate, and vice versa. I mean, we see this through time.
I think we understand between us that there are pejorative words that are applied to minorities.
Oh, absolutely. No, of course there are, right? I'm not saying that there aren't, but as you
say, the N word is, you know, now a term of friendship in the community. So you're a word that has one.
That's all. Yeah, things change, and we have to roll with that.
And I'm big on Lenny Bruce. You know, that I think that his thing about, you know, where he talks about kikes and wops and spics and all of that, that he had a point that these words have become too loaded. But the problem is they become so loaded that sometimes they go off. And, you know, as the NRA say, it's not guns that kill people, it's bullets.
Right. Fair enough. Well, I think it's, like I said, difficult topic, and not, anyway. I only related in a way to where we were going with this, because what I was trying to point out there is that, you know, we have a Bill of Rights. That's a government institutional thing we have, and I think if we were actually being ruled by a destructive cult, as we understand that term, as troublesome as the word cult is, but when we talk about destructive cults, I think we know what we're talking about. You know, that doesn't really go along with the Bill of Rights.
No.
So I have a hard time calling my government a destructive cult, you know?
It's difficult, because even when you think about destructive cults, would you know, if you look at a group like the Shakers, you know, who adopted children because they were fully celibate, and who, you know, went into decline when they were no longer allowed to adopt children. They were a pretty authoritarian Puritan group, but they gave us Shaker furniture, and they also, I'm led to believe, invented the washing machine. So there are all sorts of, you know, situations that obtain as to whether, and as I say, it's about talking about the trees without talking about the specific tree, that it's very easy to generalize outwards. Doctors do this all the time. They have these terms like irritable bowel syndrome, which means we don't know what's wrong with you, or fibromyalgia, which means we don't know what's wrong with you. But, you know, we want to sound as if we know what's wrong with you. So, you know, language becomes loaded. Language starts to be used to persuade people of things. And the easiest way to persuade somebody of something is to shift them over into a generality, a generalization, so that you can then make what's called an absolute metaphor. And there's a very good example of this in Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, that L. Ron Hubbard says the mind is like a computer. And if you have a held down 7 in the computer, all the calculations will be wrong. Now, he got lucky. The word computer changed its meaning, because when he wrote that, it meant what we call a calculator. But once you've added that metaphor in and you're saying the human mind is like a calculator, then you can keep going with the metaphor. And the problem is that once you shift into a generalization, you can keep going with the metaphor that applies to other aspects, but not this one. So I go to the doctor and I say, what are the symptoms? Not what is the symptom set that they've got 73% of, that therefore defines them as a schizophrenic or a paranoid or, you know, whatever. What are they actually suffering from? And if you look at government, they're suffering from short-termism, so that we have to get re-elected. That's the most important thing, because we're the good people. which is the
Right.
same reason that the Catholic, Anglican, Baptist, Methodist, and Jehovah's Witnesses organizations don't want to talk about child sexual abuse, because we don't want to get a bad name. So we have to, it's almost like the movement of chivalry in the Middle Ages that swept through Europe, this idea that it was a good idea to wash, and you should say nice things to ladies, and you could wear silk, and you could have food that tasted good. And there was a movement towards what was called courtly love, and this different attitude of mind from the thug culture which was ruling Europe when the Crusades began. Really terrible Nazi thug culture. And they were influenced. They changed their way. We need a change in culture that basically says, let's be pro-social. Now,
Right.
all of this conversation that we've had, if anybody wants to get into some more depth about it, is discussed in a book called The Sane Society by Eric Fromm. And he, point by point, goes through most of what we've talked about here in that book and comes to some solutions to how government might function in a more honourable way, and how it might be for the benefit of the people. And that we have a growth economy. We know that we're polluting the heck out of the planet, and yet the groups that do this, like DuPont, for example, with C8, that has now poisoned the whole world. How many people went to prison for poisoning the whole world? At least the people at 3M who invented the stuff withdrew it. But DuPont just kept on poisoning people. Or you get Pacific Gas and Electric, the Erin Brockovich story that Julia Roberts did so well. How many people went to prison? When the banking crash happened and these people stole our grandchildren's money from them,
Right.
what regulations were brought in to stop that from happening? And why weren't there any regulations? Why are we now seeing the hedge funds come back again? And there is so much going on that's to do with dishonorable behavior, with not letting the truth be spoken. The US led the world with freedom of information. That was a remarkable thing to do, to say after a certain period of time, all files should be available. Now, actually, there is a precedent. In Britain, there's the 50-year rule, which has been there for a long time. But freedom of information said, no, you can have what they're saying about you now, as long as it's not a matter of national security. And then it got tightened. We have something similar here. But the amount of misinformation in government files, the crazy things that you find. I found a thing in a file that basically, because there'd been a slip twixt cup and lip, an 8-year-old child was said to be using cannabis. Now, the original statement was that the child had been tested for cannabis on his mother's insistence and found negative. And that, according to a social worker, had become that he was a cannabis user at the age of 8. We see these things happening. We need to be able to change that. We need to be able to, but there is a way going forward. I'm sure of it. And honesty in politics is
I think you're right. I think I think integrity, I've tried to do my part to talk about manners and etiquette, which are so not in vogue right now. So it's the exact opposite. It's been pushed in the other direction. In fact, in the United States, there was actually, a year ago, I remember this huge Twitter thing it went on for a couple of weeks about civility. And people just ragged on it. Civility sucks. Civility is for the birds. Civility is authoritarian. Civility is what you say when you want to shut people up. And it's just like all this negativity towards the very idea of having mannered conversation with one another. It's that bad, right? That this is where people's heads go with this. And I think you're absolutely right that if we were going to do something on a broad basis that was going to lift everybody up, it would be bringing some of those values back. Because they
Respect.
have been in vogue in the past. And even if they were awful people who were doing it, the way that we organized and evolved the idea of enemies being able to talk to one another so that they could have treaties and not be killing each other all the time was manners. It was an agreed upon way of interacting with one another, even if you hated each other. You could follow these rules and still have what's called a civil or mannered discussion and come to some agreement or conclusion, even if you fucking hated each other and wanted to see each other dead. You could still accomplish that. We evolved that. And then we threw it in the trash when it became inconvenient. And I think it would be very, very good to bring that back. And that's my soapbox on manners.
One of the interesting things that Donald Trump did was he came to the conclusion that all of the ambassadors that the US had in the world had been Obama's people. And so he started actually pulling out professional diplomats and replacing them with business cronies. Now, you've got such
pretty usual for administrations, actually. They usually turn those things over.
Yeah, but they usually turn them over to other diplomats. And
correct.
Diplomacy is one of the most difficult of arts. And when you listen to former ambassadors and the way that they explain how they did things, what you're trying to do is to reach an agreement, not to start a war. So you have to be willing to move along. When you look at there was just one man involved, firstly under the John Major's government, the Tory government, and then under Tony Blair's government. One man was talking with the Provisional Irish Republican Army for several years, and that guy was a super diplomat, because what eventuated was that the IRA gave up their weapons. And we have something like, comparatively after 3,000 deaths and the longest military engagement in British history, we have something like peace there now. We even, in fact, they're back at Stormont talking again after 2 years of refusing to talk to each other. Something is happening there. A lot of that, I have to say, came from the women's movement, where women just said, we've had enough of this, and started sitting and talking to each other, and Catholics forgiving Protestants and Protestants forgiving Catholics, and moving forward. I think there's a fundamental idea here. And that idea is, let's talk about pro-social and anti-social. That if you're pro-social, then you're not focused upon, well, my family versus the rest of the world, which, one of the problems in the Asian system is that the head of the household is the boss. So they may have more family values, but individualism is kind of swamped when you've got some 90-year-old with dementia who's actually running the household. So it doesn't always. Yeah. But to have a pro-social value means, I think it was Charlie Chaplin who was asked if he was a patriot of America, and he said, I'm a patriot of the whole world.
Citizen of the world.
Yeah, there comes a point where you stop these generalizations about which population I belong to. I am white, I am 65, I am middle class, I am completely uneducated. There are many things that could be said about me. But when we start going, well, what's pro-social, what's for society, and what's against society? And you kind of go, well, the Geneva Conventions are pro-social. Violation of them is anti-social. As was found in the case of the British government for the bizarre hooding punishments and things, which were used later in Iraq by another government. That there are conventions that we can work towards, and there are rules, and there are certain places where naming and shaming becomes relevant. That I was shocked to see the Truth and Reconciliation movement in South Africa, which was such a calamitous failure, because what it meant was that people who had committed murder were allowed to come and confess that they'd committed murder and walk away. And that doesn't actually work. The same process in Northern Ireland. I mean, I'm still a bit worried because the agreement was to set free all of the bombers, all of the terrorists, all of the people who committed murders. And we saw a situation where the two leaders of Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams and McGuinness, who had both been involved in planning murders, became senior politicians. The same was true on the other side, to some extent.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody should be getting a pass for stuff like that, regardless of the circumstances.
Exactly. I think there is at least naming and shaming. There's the point where you say, you know, you did wrong, therefore we're not going to let you have a top job again. You know?
Yeah, at least that much. I mean,
Yeah.
fine, you forgive and forget, maybe, I guess, but forgive, let's not forget.
We've talked about this before. We both agree that we should forgive people if they are forgivable.
That's right.
Never forget what's happened, not keep bringing it up, which is what I think people mean by forgive and forget. But remember that this person, if they're given a knife, may stab people. So don't give them a knife.
Exactly. All right, so I want to move toward wrapping this up because we've been at it for a little while, and we've covered a lot of territory, like as we are wont to do.
Yep.
So my position coming around through all of this and having gone really much deeper into the propaganda issue than I expected we would, but that's fine. That's totally fine because it is probably the key awareness point that people have about their government, you know, is what they hear, what they see through the propaganda channels, right? Compared to what the government's really doing, we have so little information compared to what we are propagandized about what they're doing and what their motives and intentions are, right? So I think it was probably time well spent talking about that.
Yep.
My conclusion is still, it has been and remains that a government is a necessary body of the structure of how we form societies as human beings, and is not in and of itself, by definition, an inherent, a destructive cult. It can become that if it is misused, abused, misutilized, pushed in directions it shouldn't go. North Korea is probably the best single example I can think of where I've done a whole podcast about why I believe that country actually is a destructive cult.
Absolutely.
But that is not what the United States is. That is not what the UK is. That's not what France is. That's not what Germany is. Oh, what's that?
It's the autobiography of the poet laureate of North Korea and how he had to escape because he had the right to borrow books from the library. And once he lent one of his Jane Austen books to a friend who left it on a train, and they both realized they had to leave the country that night or be executed.
Right. So
quite a harsh regime.
I think you have structures going on there that you could argue, you could make a good argument for. And I've tried to make that argument that is a destructive cult of personality under the Kim family, et cetera. So that's kind of that's what I point to when somebody starts talking about a government being a destructive cult. I go, yeah, North Korea. Let's talk about that. But you talk about the United States, you talk about Canada, you talk about, other Western countries, and I just go, I just don't see it. I just don't look at it through that lens. I look at the tool set they use, and I see lots and lots of similarities, but I see purpose and intent being very, very different. And the day-to-day activity of what this institution called the government does is extremely different from the day-to-day of what the Sea Org does, for example, and I think that those differences matter. And so that's why I push back when people talk to me about it's all just a cult. I go, I don't think so. And that's what I'm going to wrap up with on that. But I want your input too.
I think it's very important that we start thinking about things on a spectrum. I first came to this through Simon Baron-Cohen's Zero Empathy, where he talks about the 3 spectra that he used to assess autism, because he's one of the great experts on autism. And I started going, well, everything on a spectrum. So North Korea is an example, as was Stalin's Soviet Union, as was Mao's China, as was Fidel Castro's, Mussolini or Franco. These exemplify totalitarian groups. They are at the far end of the spectrum where one individual, and this is the tradition of humanity, monarchs and presidents too often take over from monarchs, and they're given this sort of godlike authority, and then they really mess up badly. Sometimes because, like Woodrow Wilson, they go mad while they're president. Sometimes like Ronald Reagan, because they suffer from dementia while they're president. Sometimes like Richard Nixon, because as his psychiatrist said, he was mad to start with. We need to have some filters so that we can change, where power resides. But we also need a spectrum. If you look back to J. Edgar Hoover or Harry J. Anslinger and the hideous effect that they had on the United States.
Yep.
And, at times, the FBI did some great things as well, along the way. They had to hire former Texas Rangers to get Bonnie and Clyde, but despite their dragnet. But these organizations, I think if we forget the notion of cult and forget the notion of government, and we just look at organizations and groups, and we say, where on the spectrum of authoritarianism is this group? How rational are its decisions? Was prohibition, the Volstead Act, was that a sensible thing to do? To say, for 13 years, alcohol, it's illegal to make it, it's illegal to purvey it. Was that a good idea? Did it have benefits? Well, yes, it did. The health of American citizens improved during that time. But
it was a necessary thing, and getting rid of it was also just as necessary. It actually forced an evolution in a lot of ways.
Yeah, but what happened during that period was that the FBI became a potentially dangerous organization, which then, you got the enemies list under Nixon and all sorts of things. So again, we have to look, we've got to see the wood for the trees and say, is it a cult? Where is it on the spectrum? And I'm still dealing with the generalization because I'm having to bring together all the things it did. Do we really need to spend so much on the military? Could we spend more on helping people?
Yes.
Does our education system need to teach intelligent disobedience and show how the tricks are, there it is again, how the tricks are, I'm not going to wave my book at you again, and show us how the tricks are performed? Can we make a substantial change in the way that people behave? Can we get people to be compassionate? Can we get people to care about other people? Because if people don't care about anyone else, then they're of no use to society. They are either asocial, having withdrawn from society, or actually antisocial. So it's a matter of those values, which used to be considered Christian values, but I now hear Christians, spouting hate, which doesn't have anything about, loving their neighbor or their enemy as they love themselves. They don't love themselves. That's the problem, which again, Eric Fromm talks about in some
very good point there.
Yeah,
they're indoctrinated not to.
Yeah,
from a very young age.
Yeah, we've got to be taught how to hate. The words go something like that in South Pacific, that wonderful film about racism, musical about racism. That that which is different from me is wrong. Well, no, that which is different from me is different. And
exactly.
Culture, as far as I can see, only advances when cultures meet, and you get fusion cuisine. If you want to look at the Impressionist movement in painting, people are really interested, say, in Van Gogh. Van Gogh was mad about, well, he was mad actually, but he was mad about Japanese ukiyo-e prints. And when you've got that and you realize that to draw he used a Japanese reed pen, you find influences move through and create something new and wonderful.
Right.
And the whole idea that we can somehow separate back to some Paleolithic way of being and still keep the world functioning, it's just crazy. You can't and mustn't do that. And as I said earlier, we're all just different shades of black. That's what the evidence shows. We're all descended there's some controversy about it, but the mitochondrial Eve 238,000 years ago is the descendant of everyone alive. We are all brothers and sisters, and
Exactly.
we need to learn how to behave that way. But that means that we need to behave responsibly towards those who are antisocial, not to, crucify them or do something horrible to them, but to find out how to stop them from having an influence and see if there's anything at all we can do to understand their condition better, which is why I wish Jeffrey Dahmer had completed his interviews, and anything we can do to help them. But our system has become punitive. It's not rehabilitating people. It's making things worse.
Right.
And, wherever there was a situation here, there was a reform school called Pepper Harrow in the early 1970s. And they made a documentary about it. And it freaked me out. 20 years later, they went back and there were 6 children involved in this. The oldest was 14 at the time. And he was illiterate. He was 14. He could not read and write. One of the kids died along the way. One didn't want to be interviewed. So they got 4 of them. And all 4 of them who'd been through Pepper Harrow had actually achieved things with their life. The guy who at 14 couldn't read and write was now the head of child services for the county. So that's where he'd ended up. And they showed that the recidivism rate for Pepper Harrow was 10%. Only 10% of those kids committed another crime. The recidivism rate for most of our institutions is now around about 80%, I believe.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. And
So
that's an institution I will definitely agree was never put there for rehabilitation, at least as we see it in the United States, and I believe as we see it in Britain. It was the purpose was always eye for an eye. It's sort of a biblical justice factory that just produces more criminals. It's not a matter of rehabilitation.
No, and what's more,
the real cancer in our society, actually.
The actual psychopaths managed to talk their way out onto parole.
Yeah, it's got so many problems with it. Okay, let's wrap up. We could keep going for hours, but I think we've covered enough that I think we've given people some food for thought, at least. Really nice comments in here, by the way, as we were going. I did not mean to ignore all of you.
Just some of you.
Yeah, just some of you, but thank you. And there obviously is a lot of food for further discussion here in a lot of this stuff. So I'm sure we will be doing more of these in the future.
Yeah, and if people come back to us with questions and with, deliberations about what we said, we are always extraordinarily interested to get into that debate. And I'd like to point something out that's very important to me.
Mm-hmm.
I love cognitive dissonance. I like it when people disagree with me. I've had to learn to do it, obviously, but it's like, jumping in, into a cold shower and coming to enjoy it. But if I'm wrong about something, I'd like to be put right. And that's an attitude of mind that we need to really get into, because one of the worst things that individuates people from society is the need to always be right and not being able to change our minds. It was probably Richard Feynman or somebody who said, I have no belief that I would not happily change within 5 minutes if given the evidence. So
that's right. I agree with that. In fact, I'll go one further and say, I have said for a long time, because I love my cliches, I have said for a long time, I don't know are the 3 most important words in critical thinking.
And there are 4 words there. So
yeah, whatever. And
sorry, I do not know.
I know. And I was wrong are the 3 hardest words for any human being to say. Those are the 3, so I relate on those two levels,
And to grow up and to become adults, which, when I was a kid, I thought the purpose of life was to achieve enlightenment, at 17. Now, there was an English actor called Martin Shaw, and somebody said to him, what did you want to be when you grew up, when you were a kid? And he looked at the interview and he said, a grown-up. And that's what I aspire to. That I think
Right.
that we grow up when we stop defending ourselves and our egos so thoroughly, where we realize it really doesn't matter what people say about us all that much, as long as it's not to the judge, obviously. And that we can live more easily with the world by becoming more, having more humility, being able to accept our imperfection and rejoice in it, in my case.
Yeah, it's still a skill set that I am learning. I preach it. I talk about it. I do. I know. I understand that it is the right way to be, and struggle with it every day as a content creator who gets feedback, and sometimes some pretty nasty feedback. And it's a difficult topic. But actually, that's probably the subject of another podcast too. So with that, we are wrapping up. And I wanted to say to everybody out there as well, of course, if you're watching this in the future, thank you very much, everybody, for your super chats, for your support. Really, really helpful. And I hope that this conversation was worth it. I hope we gave you guys some things to think about and maybe talk amongst yourselves about and sort of consider and come back and chew on. And I'm curious about your feedback on it, actually. What do you guys have to say about everything we talked about? And I wish I could have gotten to all the questions that we were asked, but that's not really real when we're having the discussions we're having. But thank you very much for your contributions, guys. Really appreciate it during the live stream here. And certainly some of your comments got me thinking along lines that influenced our conversation. So even if I didn't read it out or anything, thanks for that.
And you can go through them and see whether, we can have a list of those questions to respond to.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. In the future. And then finally, my last plug, if you like what I'm doing and you think this channel's cool and you want to support it, join me on Patreon. Link is below. And it's what keeps these lights on and keeps my little mixing board going and all of that. So consider joining me there, because that's just a wonderful, great thing to do.
And at the same time, consider my Patreon account.
Yes, just subscribe to John's channel if you're not subscribed. He's got a YouTube channel. Yep. I will link it in the show notes. Definitely do that now. And then support John through his channel as well, because he and I are in the same boat on that. All right.
Yep.
And with that, we are wrapping up this stream. See you guys soon. Actually, see you tomorrow at our call-in show where I will be joined by my lovely wife, Melissa. And you'll even get some 7 cam. So you get to see our cat 7 as well. All right, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks. And the shortage for 2 months of toilet paper in the Western world,
Yeah, let's not forget that.